Deep in the earth, beneath the boreal forests of northern Alberta, lies one of the largest, most valuable, and most controversial natural resources on the planet. It's a form of petroleum so thick, so difficult to extract, it's been compared to peanut butter mixed with molasses. This is the Canadian oil sands, and locked within it is a value so immense, it's almost impossible to comprehend. But what if I told you that, metaphorically speaking, a single barrel of this Canadian oil could be worth as much as a kilogram of solid gold? No, we're not talking about a literal price tag. We're talking about a measure of potential, a value equivalent to over $279,000 per barrel, based on the current price of gold. That figure represents trillions of dollars of national wealth, an economic superpower in waiting. But for decades, this immense fortune has been trapped, not by geology or by technology, but by a single critical vulnerability, a bottleneck of steel stretching thousands of kilometers across the continent. Canada has been sitting on a treasure chest, but it lost the key. For decades, this country has been forced to sell its most valuable commodity at a staggering discount, sometimes losing tens of billions of dollars a year. The problem has pitted regions against each other, challenged the authority of prime ministers, and raised profound questions about the country's future. But now, the game is changing. A new, multi-billion-dollar artery of steel has finally come to life. Suddenly, Canada's trapped oil isn't just a domestic problem, it's a global fixation. In this video, we'll explore how pipeline gridlock has held a G7 nation's economy hostage, and we'll ask the crucial question: now that the first new export pipeline in a generation is finally open, can Canada truly unleash its trapped wealth? To understand why a barrel of Canadian oil could be spoken of in the same breath as gold, you first have to understand the sheer scale of the resource. Canada is home to the world's third largest proven oil reserves, surpassed only by Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. The overwhelming majority of this oil, about 97%, isn't the liquid crude that gushes from a desert well. It's found in the Athabasca oil sands. Imagine a deposit of sand, clay, water, and a thick, tar-like substance called bitumen. This is the oil sands. It's a geological anomaly of epic proportions, covering an area of 142,000 square kilometers, a region larger than England. For most of the 20th century, this resource was considered largely inaccessible, just too difficult and expensive to bother with. Extracting it isn't a simple matter of drilling a hole. For reserves close to the surface, it involves one of the largest earth-moving operations in human history. Giant shovels scoop the sand into colossal trucks, which haul it to processing facilities where the bitumen is separated using hot water. For deeper reserves, a more complex method called steam-assisted gravity drainage, or SAGD, is used. This involves drilling two horizontal wells, one above the other. Steam is injected into the top well, heating the bitumen until it's fluid enough to flow down into the lower well, from where it can be pumped to the surface. Both methods are energy-intensive, expensive, and produce a product that can't simply be poured into a pipeline. Raw bitumen at room temperature has the consistency of a hockey puck. To move it, it must be either upgraded into a synthetic crude oil or, more commonly, diluted with lighter hydrocarbons. This mixture is known as diluted bitumen, or dilbit. It's this heavy, viscous nature that makes Canadian oil unique and challenging. It requires specialized refineries to process and a dedicated infrastructure to transport. Yet, the sheer volume of this resource, an estimated 1.7 trillion barrels, with at least 164 billion considered economically recoverable with today's technology, makes it a cornerstone of the global energy supply. This is Canada's buried treasure, a generational endowment of wealth. But a treasure is only valuable if you can get it to market. And for decades, that has been Canada's trillion-dollar problem. Canada's pipeline bottleneck. The fundamental problem for Canada's oil industry can be summed up in one word: geography. The oil sands are in landlocked Alberta, thousands of kilometers from the ocean and from the major refining centers on the U.S. Gulf Coast. To move this oil, Canada relies almost entirely on a circulatory system of steel pipelines. And for most of the 21st century, that system has been critically clogged. For years, Canada's pipeline network simply didn't have enough capacity to move all the oil being produced. It was like trying to drain a swimming pool with a garden hose. This created a perpetual bottleneck. As production from the oil sands grew, producers found themselves competing for limited space on existing pipelines. This imbalance gave the primary buyer of Canadian oil, the United States, immense pricing power. This led to a phenomenon that has haunted the Canadian economy: the Western Canadian Select, or WCS, price differential. WCS is the benchmark price for Canadian heavy crude. Because it was so difficult to get Canadian oil to global markets, it consistently traded at a significant discount to the North American benchmark, West Texas Intermediate, or WTI. Think of it as a landlocked discount. While a barrel of WTI might be selling for $70 in Texas, that same barrel's Canadian equivalent, WCS, might only fetch $55 or even less in Alberta. At times, this discount has exploded to catastrophic levels. In late 2018, the differential blew out to more than $45 a barrel. Producers were losing a staggering amount of money on every barrel they sold. The provincial government of Alberta took the unprecedented step of forcing companies to cut production just to ease the glut and bring the price back from the brink. The economic damage was immense, costing the Canadian economy tens of billions of dollars a year in lost revenue and investment. The obvious solution was to build more pipelines, but this proved to be one of the most difficult political and social challenges in modern Canadian history. Projects that promised to solve the bottleneck were proposed, debated, and ultimately defeated. The Keystone XL pipeline, which would have carried over 800,000 barrels a day to the U.S. Gulf Coast, became a flashpoint for environmental protests and was eventually canceled by the U.S. government after more than a decade of debate. The Energy East pipeline, a project to carry oil to Canada's east coast for export to Europe, was canceled in 2017 amid regulatory hurdles and political opposition. Every new proposal seemed to run into the same wall of resistance, a combination of environmental concerns, Indigenous land rights, and provincial squabbling. Canada was at an impasse, its most valuable export trapped by an invisible prison of politics and steel. With other routes blocked, all hopes turned to one project: the Trans Mountain Expansion, or TMX. The original Trans Mountain Pipeline, built in 1953, was the only pipeline connecting Alberta's oil to the Pacific coast. The expansion project aimed to build a second, parallel pipe that would nearly triple the system's capacity from 300,000 barrels per day to 890,000. This wouldn't just add more capacity, it would fundamentally change the equation. For the first time, Canada would have significant access to a tidewater port, allowing it to ship its oil directly to fast-growing markets in Asia and beyond, breaking its near-total dependence on the U.S. The promise was enormous: a narrower price differential, higher revenues for producers, and billions in new taxes. But the path to completion was a saga of conflict and soaring costs. The project faced fierce opposition from environmental groups, some provincial governments, and several Indigenous communities along its route. Protests and legal challenges mounted. In 2018, with the project on the verge of collapse, the Canadian federal government made a stunning decision. It bought the entire pipeline system from its private sector owner, Kinder Morgan, for $4.5 billion. The government argued the pipeline was in the national interest, and it would ensure the expansion got built. It was a massive gamble. The construction costs, originally estimated at around $5.4 billion, began to balloon. The final price tag soared to a staggering $34 billion, paid for by the Canadian taxpayer. It became one of the most expensive and controversial infrastructure projects in the country's history. But after years of delays and political firestorms, In the spring of 2024, oil finally began to flow through the newly expanded line. The impact of TMX opening was immediate. The very prospect of it coming online helped stabilize the volatile WCS price differential. Since TMX started operations, the wild price swings of the past have been largely tamed, with the discount to WTI moving within a much narrower range than the historical average. While the discount hasn't vanished, it has hovered in the teens, sometimes better, sometimes worse. The catastrophic blowouts of the past have so far been avoided. This has provided a crucial boost. With access to global markets, Canadian producers are no longer solely at the mercy of U.S. buyers. In the first year of operation, crude oil exports from British Columbia surged, with nearly half of the volume going to non-U.S. destinations like China, Singapore, and India for the first time. The pipeline began moving hundreds of thousands of barrels per day to the coast, with flows reaching over 700,000 BD in the first half of 2025. For the first time in a generation, a significant portion of Canada's trapped wealth was finally being set free. The $34 billion pipeline represented a monumental shift, but the relief might be short-lived. The Trans Mountain expansion was a crucial victory, but it was just one battle in a much larger war for market access. Here's the new problem. Canada's oil production keeps growing. Producers expect to increase output by around 3.5% to 4.6% in 2026 alone. As a result, even with the new TMX capacity, Canada's export pipelines are once again approaching their limits. The expanded Trans Mountain is already running at high utilization. Analysts predict that without more capacity, Canada's entire pipeline network could be persistently full as early as the winter of 2026-2027, risking a return to wider, more painful price discounts. The race is now on to build the next wave of infrastructure before that happens. Several projects are being explored to stay ahead of the curve. Trans Mountain itself is already planning smaller-scale expansions, hoping to use drag-reducing agents and new pumping stations to add another 290,000 barrels per day of capacity. Enbridge, which runs the country's largest pipeline network, has sanctioned an expansion of its mainline system that will add 150,000 barrels per day of capacity in 2027. Meanwhile, there's renewed talk of reviving parts of the canceled Keystone XL project under a new proposal from company South Bow, which could add another 450,000 barrels per day of export capacity to the United States. The Alberta provincial government is also pushing for an entirely new, privately funded pipeline to the West Coast, with a formal proposal expected by mid-2026. These projects could be the final keys needed to fully unlock the value of Canada's oil. But the old challenges haven't disappeared. Opposition from some Indigenous groups remains, particularly on the BC coast, and the complex political relationship with the United States creates uncertainty for any project heading south. The year 2026 has become a critical turning point. The story of Canada's oil is a story of immense potential constrained by a singular challenge. For years, the nation has watched as its most valuable commodity was sold at a discount, a frustrating symbol of trapped wealth and unrealized opportunity. The metaphorical value of that oil, a value comparable to gold, remained locked away, not by rock, but by red tape and political gridlock. The completion of the Trans Mountain expansion in 2024 was a turning point. It cracked open the door to global markets, providing price stability and new customers in Asia. The $34 billion price tag, once seen as a national scandal, is now viewed by some as a prescient investment in economic sovereignty. Today, Canada stands at a crossroads. The breathing room provided by TMX is already shrinking as oil production continues to rise. New pipeline proposals are on the table, promising to finally, decisively, solve the bottleneck that has plagued the country for a generation. But the clock is ticking. Will Canada seize this moment? Will it build the final links in the chain needed to transform itself from a constrained resource supplier into a true global energy superpower? Or will the old divisions and delays resurface, leaving that $300,000 barrel of metaphorical gold once again trapped underground? The decisions made in the next few years will echo for decades, determining the economic destiny of a nation. What do you think? Is now the time for Canada to double down on building energy infrastructure? Or should the focus be elsewhere? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into the complex world of energy and economics, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching.